KROC-AM, it's Rochester's Good Morning, 8:42 already here on a sunny day. Going to get up into the upper 70s today. Right now we're at 68 at KROC-AM. I'm Rich Peterson along with Kim David, and we have a special guest. She is an assistant professor of criminal justice in the College of Criminology, Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. Dr. Katherine Brown joins us this morning to talk about the Jacob Wetterling case. Good morning, Dr. Brown. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
The Wetterling case, the most famous cold case in Minnesota history, has apparently come to an end here with a confession by the killer, Dan Heinrich, and a pretty chilling confession, I must say. And it was, how unusual is it for the family to agree to a type of a plea deal? Is this unusual? And once the confession is out there, I'm wondering if they wish they could take it all back.
Well, one thing people have to understand that for the family, this doesn't really provide closure because there is no such thing when you lose a child, but it does provide answers to them. And of course, the prosecutor went to them and they agreed to the plea deal so that they would have answers. And obviously, the details are horrific, and I can't even imagine what it would be like to listen to those details if it was your child. But it's part of their healing and grieving process. So hopefully they can start healing.
I just don't ever recall a case like this. I mean, a judge and the prosecutors, you want to get an admission on the record in court, open court, on the official record. But in this case, there's no conviction. It was just kind of like he admitted to this crime, but then that was it. I can never recall a case like this where, I mean, there are other cases where they plead to one charge and then the other ones are either dismissed or whatever, but you know, there may be an admission or something. Here in Minnesota, we have what's called an Elford plea, where you admit to something only because you agree there's enough evidence for a conviction, but you don't really admit you did anything. And there's the McNaughton ruling, which means you were too drunk or whatever, that you don't remember what happened. But something like this, I just don't ever remember a case like this. Is something like this pretty unusual?
Well, it's not unusual for a killer to decide to plead for a variety of reasons. Obviously, Minnesota is not a death penalty state, and from what I understand, the offender wasn't exactly willing or ready to talk at each moment. So he agreed to do that, and they sort of had to act on spur of the moment. And let's remember, they probably would never have found Jacob's remains without his confession. But killers do confess for a variety of reasons, and it could be as simple as he knew he was going to go to prison for the federal charges of child pornography, and he wanted to revisit his crime scene one more time. It's doubtful that he did it because he felt remorse and wanted the family to have those answers.
Yeah, not at this point.
Yeah. Well, all these years, and that's the other thing I think that disturbs people. You know, that case had so much attention here in Minnesota. Every year on the anniversary, during the first initial years with the ongoing investigation, we had some callers here to the radio station who actually were involved in some of the initial searches up there. And you think, all this media attention and everything else, and all this time, this guy knew what he had done, and
apparently the young man was killed. The boy was killed within hours.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's actually very typical of child abductions, where children are going to be murdered. About 76% of them are murdered in under 3 hours. So this case in particular did tend to follow the national trends, unfortunately, of children who would be murdered in abductions.
So what is this, the legacy of this case now? Obviously, the family, you have to respect Patty and her husband as far as how they've handled the whole situation. They kept it in the news all these years. They did their best to do that. Plus, they started really changed the face of protecting missing children and finding them.
Well, absolutely, and I think that is the legacy of this case, that they did take something that was a personal tragedy, it was a state tragedy, and the nation grieves for these children who are abducted and murdered. So they've certainly done their best to not only find answers in their case, but to help other families avoid being in that position. And I think that's the takeaway from this case.
So often you think of cities, larger cities would, with more vast, more populated cities would be the site of abductions, but this is a town of 6,500. It was out in the rural area, and it's just so sad. I don't know what parents can do other than these days you just try to keep an eye on your kid as much as possible, but you can't watch them all the time.
Well, and I think it's important for the public to know that child abduction murders are incredibly rare. They are less than 0.5% of all homicides in the United States. In any given year, we have between 40 and 150 incidents of child abduction murder, but fortunately it is rare, and most parents won't have to go through something like this.
What do you think as far as the Wetterlings are concerned now? I mean, they always had hope that he would come back and just kind of show up out of the blue, and now that's gone. They had the hope, now there is no hope. Where do they go from here?
Well, I think that they will continue their advocacy for children. I think they will take the time that they need, and I hope they do, to grieve, and that process looks different for every family. But I certainly see them continuing the wonderful work that they've done to help protect other children, because that is how they want Jacob to be remembered, and that's what they want his legacy to be.
Yeah, his mom pretty much said that at the news conference the other day, and you get this feeling, though, as Rich mentioned, they were really holding out hope that he would be found alive, and you hear
Absolutely.
People say that they're going to have closure now because they know what happened and his remains have been recovered. But really, I don't know if it's closure, because you were hoping he would come home alive.
Yeah. I hate the term closure, because for families who've lost children, there is no such thing as closure. The rest of society or friends may move on, and family, but for these families, it's something that they will always remember. So I think it's important that they have answers, and that they now have his remains, and they can bring him home to where they would like to grieve him privately. But closure is I think, the wrong term to use for parents who have lost murdered children.
Mm-hmm.
20 years in prison on a federal child pornography charge. That's what he gets. And then after that, he'll probably be in a sex offender, in custody at a sex offender place, or likely anyway. That enough? I think some of us want him to suffer a little bit more. And I'm sure it's not like 20 years in prison is going to be fun for him.
No, I agree. And I think one thing we have to realize, there really is no justice this side of heaven for these types of offenders. So there's nothing that we can do to him as a society that really equals what he did to Jacob. So what we can hold on to is that he will be removed from society, so he won't be able to hurt other children, because keep in mind, he's responsible for 9 other attacks on children who were not murdered, and unfortunately the statute of limitations had already passed on both the series of boys that he attacked in Painesville and the Shirel attack. So is it enough? No. If you want eye for an eye, it won't ever be enough, but at least he will serve. He will be removed from society, and he will be supervised afterwards, so that he won't have the opportunity to harm another child.
Yeah.
We see the photographs and video of this guy now. He was arrested about a year ago. Now he's 53, and we've seen the photographs of him, and But then you stop and think, wait a minute, that was 26 years ago. He was like in his mid to late 20s. Is that unusual for someone at that age to do what he did?
Actually, I believe he was 27 when he committed the attack, or around that age, and that is actually the average age of child abduction murder offenders in the United States. They do tend to be slightly older than general homicide offenders.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, now you see the photograph.
He
and
looks like a dirty,
he looks like a
scum.
Dirty old man, I guess is what you call it or whatever. But you think back, wait a minute, he was in his 20s when this was going on, the Jacob case and the other ones.
So you follow up on cold cases around the country. How many are there? Many other similar cases like this going on? I'm sure there probably are.
Well, there are similar cases, and keep in mind, sometimes cases go cold for a reason. They might have identified a person of interest, which they had in this case, early on in the investigation, and then there may not be evidence actually linking that offender to the case. Fortunately, child abduction murders have a much higher solvability rate than the homicides in general. About 76% of these cases tend to be solved because they do have more resources devoted, and they do tend to get under the skin of the investigators that work on them. So the good news is that they have a higher probability of solvability, but the bad news is that unfortunately some families do have to wait for that justice.
Yeah, we had, the newspaper boy down in Iowa, Johnny Gosh, I think his name.
He's still out there.
And then even, the Jody Huisentruit case, the TV anchor lady who went to work one day and disappeared. And it's just, these cases are still out there. And
Absolutely. But I think it's important for the public to understand, we know statistically that when cases go cold, if you go back and review that first week of the case, there's a high probability that the offender's name is actually in that case file, even though they may not be known to detectives as a suspect. So there are methodologies to working cold cases and re-examining it. Unfortunately, some jurisdictions don't have the manpower. But many detectives spend their careers working on the cases that they couldn't solve and are dedicated to trying to find answers in those cases.
Dr. Katherine Brown, assistant professor in the School of Criminology at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. Thank you very much for your insight this morning, and I guess enjoy the rest of your day.
You're welcome.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katherine Brown. It's 5 minutes away from 9 o'clock at KROC-AM.